Welcome back to the Capes and Tights podcast right here on capesandtights.com. I'm your host, Justin Soderberg. This episode is brought to you once again by Galactic Comics and Collectibles at galacticcomicsandcollectibles.com. We welcome writer from TV, film, and comic books, David A. Goodman, to the podcast to discuss The Masked Macher from Dark Horse Comics. David is known for his work as staff writers on series such as Family Guy, The Orville, Star Trek Enterprise, Futurama, as well as the upcoming Hysteria. He also wrote a movie called Honor Society, which came out a couple of years ago. He served as producer in a number of different TV shows that you probably know. But in the world of comics, he's also written the Orville comic series that paired up with the TV show, as well as the series called Space Job, which came out a couple of years ago. And what we talked about mostly on this episode, The Masked Macher, which is available now at your local comic book shop. So check that out. This is David A. Goodman, staff writer for multiple TV shows out there and comic book writer for books like Space Job and the currently being released Masked Macher, right here on the Capes and Tights podcast. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, David. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you, Justin?
I'm doing wonderful. My kids aren't sleeping, but that's what it takes like when I have a young kids, right? I mean, which means I'm not sleeping, right, David?
Mine aren't sleeping either, but they're in their 20s, so it's
their own problem.
Yeah.
Exactly. It was kind of funny. I went to a Comic-Con this weekend and people were always like, how's it going? We were out drinking last night. And I was like, yeah, I was home with my kids. I was probably sleeping as much as you were, but not the same reasoning. You were having more fun probably, but no. They're like, why didn't you come back out after you put your kids to sleep? Because I was like, I went home and I sat down. That was the problem.
And that was the end of it. That was the end of it.
Done. But yeah, exactly. But yeah, we're here to talk some comics. You are a writer extraordinaire of multiple facets. You write TV, movies, things like that. But like comics is your number one thing. But before I get into comics really quickly, I wanted to say that one of the shows that my parents watched when I was a kid growing up was Wings. And after I found out that you had written a couple episodes of Wings, I haven't seen it probably since the 90s. So I couldn't be like, oh, yeah, that episode. But I was like, oh, my God. And now I need to find I don't even know where you can stream it now or if it's available for streaming. But I'm like, I need to go back and watch the show again because I could just picture,
that's funny.
It's the Wings TV show. It was
You grew up in Maine? Is that?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and the show took place on Nantucket, so I guess that was the
close enough. But it was just kind of funny. I was like, oh my gosh, and people probably are like, oh, you worked on Golden Girls, obviously Family Guy, all that stuff, but I'm like, no, Wings, man, I gotta bring up Wings, but no. Well, let's start, David, a little bit. Like, so what got you into writing in the first place? Like, let's as an overall arching topic here. But what led you to actually physically getting down pen on paper and writing something?
It's a good question. I think that when I graduated college in the '80s, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and I thought I had a vague idea about being a writer, but probably books was what I was thinking. And I got jobs in New York working as an assistant in publishing companies, but then I got this job at a TV production company, and I think I always thought I wanted to write for television, but I didn't even know that how to do it. Like I'm from a suburb of New York. I didn't know anybody in show business. Back then, with no internet, most people didn't even know that television writing was a job. And that's changed completely. But back then, and I just so happened that I got a job as an assistant to a television producer who was a writer, a woman named Gloria Banta, who had written for some great shows in the 70s, Mary Tyler Moore and Rhoda and these great sitcoms. And she encouraged me and my partner, who is from Bangor, Maine, Rick Kopp, to write sample scripts. And so it was really just this kind of thing that happened. We sat down, we were both big TV watchers. We both had just kind of an instinctual idea of how to come up with a sitcom story, and we did sitcom, and we wrote these two sample scripts, and then we were hired on the Golden Girls. And my journey as a writer obviously began there, and obviously it's a great place to start. I learned so much and worked with some great writers. As time went on, I really started to want to do also other kinds of writing. I enjoy writing comedy, but I I wrote books, and I was a big Star Trek fan. I ended up writing for Star Trek, and then my partner and I split up very amicably, and I started doing some other things. I worked in animation, and then was also writing sci-fi, the Star Trek, and then wrote these books, and then it led to sort of where it started, which as I was when I was a kid reading and collecting comic books, that was probably something even I didn't think of as a job. Obviously knew the names of the writers, but I didn't really stop to think about how do you become a comic book writer. And so now that after a 36-year career in television, I'm writing comics is kind of funny. I think, but great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny how you say that. You know that there's a writer. It's like there's jobs for these things. Same thing with TV, but it's like it almost feels like it's royalty. Like I know there's the King of England, but like I can never be that. Like it's just not
Right.
something that I can do. And
Right.
until
Right.
you actually get the chance, and obviously that is something that I can't do.
Right.
However, writing and being in these titles and these positions that people have,
Yeah.
it's just kind of funny. It seems like such a far off thing that you can't
Right.
actually accomplish.
I mean, as a kid, I went to a lot of comic conventions, and I'd listen to writers like Jim Shooter and Marv Wolfman and all these from the guys who were writing comics in the 60s and 70s, who were the guys who stuffed Jerry Conway, all these guys who were writing the stuff that I was reading. And yet I never sort of put together that you would sit down and write a comic book. It was an interesting. I agree with you that you would look at these people as like there's some kind of magic there.
Yeah, you have to become friends with Jim Shooter at some point in your career to actually become a writer because you have to know someone and know someone and know someone. And
Right.
nowadays, I mean, you mentioned the internet, the number of people who have gotten jobs based off just Twitter DMs or an email or whatever, just being like, hey, I have a new comic coming out. I'm looking for an artist. And you just DM someone, and all of a sudden, I know you have an artist and you have a relationship, and then they're working
Yeah.
together for 10 years. It's such a different world, I'm guessing, into creating comics like how harder it would have been for you to create comics 35 years ago when you started out. It's
Right.
compared to right now. Right now, it's a little
Well,
not
I
easy,
had
but it's
yeah.
easier.
Well, I had the advantage of that I was working on a big TV show, the Orville, and I said to Seth MacFarlane, who created the Orville, I said, let's do an Orville comic, and I did it specifically for my own. I wanted to write comics, and Seth said, "Great, Seth, go forth." And the studio made a deal with Dark Horse to do a tie-in comic that I would write, and I'd never written comics. I was very excited to get to write these comics. I knew a lot of comic writers, Jeff Johns
Yeah.
and a few others,
Okay.
and Jerry Duggan, and they helped me understand the format. But I had this sort of advantage of the show, even, and not really anybody really realizing I was driving that so that I would get a chance to write comics.
Mm.
That's a very lucky
Yeah.
position I was in. So
I've talked to people on here who are, authors, novelists, and then dabbled in comics or switched over to comics or do both and so on and so forth. They find that stories are made for specific mediums sometimes, and
yep.
so like your comics, like Space Job over at Dark Horse, and this your latest comic is it Masked Macher? Am I saying that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
Macher is fine. Macher
Okay.
is
Do you find that, first of all, like, is there a similarity in writing for TV versus comics? And also, is these two stories were like, did it make sense to sell these in comics? I mean, Space Job has a similarity to the Orville in a sense where they're, comedy in space and
right.
things like that. But like, do these comics just need to be, or these stories just need to be in comic format to you? Or is it just an avenue to tell these stories?
Well, certainly the most recent one, the Masked ended up feeling like this could only be done in a comic. there is when I was doing the tie-in comic for the Orville, my goal with that was that a fan of the Orville reading it would feel like, oh, this could be an episode. So there are no thought balloons, there are no stage directions. It's all visuals and dialogue telling the story. And because I as a reader of comics as a kid, I always was disappointed by Star Trek comics because they didn't feel like episodes to me. And so that was my goal with that. Space Job actually started out as a pilot for a TV show. I'd written a pilot. But what I did with the comic was the comic is true to that pilot script, but it expands it. The world can get a little bigger in a lot bigger in a comic. You're not as limited by budget in a certain way, but also part of the premise of that comic was working in space is going to just be as shitty as working in an office. Yes. I mean that, and so there was also a way in which that was part of the comic was the limitations of it, but also I also got to expand it a little bit. I tell the story, the sort of the future history of this world, which I didn't in the pilot. Like I could really do a little world building in the comic that I couldn't do. And then Masked Macher was actually originally an idea, a pitch for an animated show that I was developing with one of the wrestling companies. And then they decided they didn't want to do scripted television anymore. And so I had all this work. But then as I was writing it and as I'm sort of filling in the world, and then the great, art that Alex Andres did really changed it, really made it deeper. I felt like more noirish. And so there's a way, and then there's a twist at the end of the first issue, which would have worked in an animated show, but this is not how I would have done it in an animated show. The way I'm telling this story is very much of the medium of comics. So I feel like from that first Orville comic now into this, I've fully grown into this comic can only really be a comic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would watch it as a show. Like it's one of those things that I probably would have caught my attention, but in the same sense, like, yeah, I'm not sure if after reading this issue it would have been like, yeah, wouldn't have stuck the same. I also feel like comics sometimes can feel like episodes of TV, like individual issues. Right. And I feel like this would have had to been one episode, but I feel like it wouldn't have been one episode. It would have been like multiple episodes, and that wouldn't have worked in that sense either. But for those who don't know, who are going to listen to this podcast, what is the Masked Macher to people? Like, what is this comic?
So the idea of the Masked Macher is that it's 1930s, it's Hollywood, and its main character, Tony Hollywood, is this actor who thinks he's going to be this big star, gets a flat tire in front of a wrestling arena, and the owner of the wrestling arena, a little Jewish old lady named Mickey, gives him a mask, tells him to put it on, I'll give you $5 if you get in the ring. And he suddenly finds himself in this world of professional wrestling in the 1930s in Hollywood, which I've completely made up. But the idea is a comment. It's a comment on show business. It's a comment on being a star. It's the fun of doing a wrestling comic, and the idea that all the wrestling moves we know today were created in this little wrestling arena by one of the characters in the book, and there's also comments on race and sex, and in that he is this mediocre white guy who is sort of being held up by all these other people around him of varying race and sex, and so that's the basic idea, but it's at heart a comedy, and the comic is being narrated by someone. And it's a big twist at the end of the issue when you find out who. That really throws you into this comic world in a
Mhm.
way, that this fake comic world that I've made up of 1930s Hollywood. Um, I don't know if you've read the comic.
Yes,
Does that
yes.
does that a
Yeah,
good?
yeah, and I
Yeah,
think it's great without actually giving away too much. And that's one of those things that's hard to do when you talk about something that has like current.
yeah,
We could sit here and talk Wings or the Orville, and I'd feel safe to do that because
right,
I love those shows, and I don't care about spoiling them because they've been on
right,
TV for long enough. You guys can figure it out. But something that comic book just came out September 18th. I think we're in a point position where like, no, we still want you to buy it and read it, so
yeah,
don't
yeah,
spoil it. But it's true, and I think that so what comedy in comics is such a difficult thing in my opinion. I feel
yeah.
like it's so polarizing to some people, and I feel like horror fits all horror fans for the most part, whereas comedy, it's like not all avenues of comedy hits the same way for people.
Yeah.
And I find it very hard. And I feel like in Space Job, and the funny thing about this is when we talked via email and through Messenger about coming on, it was funny because you were on my mind when Space Job came out in 2023 about
Oh
getting
yeah.
you on the podcast. And then things
Oh,
just spiraled and rolled and didn't, things moved along and so on and so forth. And I was like, oh, and then when we reached out, I was like, oh, this is great because I loved Space Job and I wanted to talk about Space Job. So because comedy is so, like I said, so different in comic books, in my opinion,
yeah.
which is funny to think
Yeah.
about because a lot of people think that comic books are just comedy, those on the
Right.
outside.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but do you feel like it's hard to tell jokes and be funny in comics nowadays, or is it just part of your
I
life nowadays?
I mean, for me, like the way it works, the way it worked in both Space Job and Masked Macher, and to some extent the Orville comic, is it's the characters.
Yeah.
That the characters are larger than life, and they're saying, I think that you're also in both comics. There's both in both Space Job and Masked Macher. There's a sense of people who are sort of trapped with a bad boss. And that to me is a great, very relatable source of comedy, that you've got this idiot who you're working for.
Mhm.
And you can't get this idiot to see that they're being an idiot because they're essentially in charge, or you have to follow them, or you need them.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where I find the comedy, to me, that to me also part of I think why I love how these comics came out is, in both cases I played it straight. I have the artists, they don't, nobody looks silly.
Mhm.
The type of art that's in both of these books is realistic,
Mhm.
in the sense of they're not, because that, I think, when you see something played straight, something, it's going to be funnier if the people look real, if they look
Mhm.
like kind of cartoonish characters, that can actually undermine your jokes. And then the premise is so, I think that Tony Hollywood, the main character of Space Job, is so, um, it's sad, and you sort of connect to him in a sad way in the comic, that that also helps you, like,
Mhm.
your emotional connection to the people in the comic helps you laugh at the absurdity of these situations. But
Mhm.
in both cases, my style of comedy in comics is a world that you can believe,
Mhm.
and that then it's the characters in the world that are funny.
Mhm. Yeah, and I honestly think from the very beginning, you're getting into a comedic comic book from the cover because you actually wrote a little joke basically with the title of the book, like
Right, right,
by explaining the joke before the joke was even after the joke was told.
right.
It was actually kind of funny. I'm like, okay, this seems like my kind of humor.
Yeah,
But I think that's also what Seth MacFarlane and your writing team over at Orville did well too. I think with the design of the characters on the Orville, some of them were a little extreme, but most of them, if someone just sat down and you had it on mute and someone was just in the room with you, they think you were just watching another version of
right,
Star Trek or something like that. Like from a distance, it just looked like a regular space show, and
right.
then the jokes and the humor and all that stuff come later. And I think that's the same thing with like Space Job and even this one, where it's like it just, if someone from a distance saw me reading the Masked Mocker at a table, they wouldn't immediately go, "Oh, that's a funny comic book." And
Right,
I think
right,
that helps with their humor in that sense too, like you were
right.
saying. It doesn't go over the top. in
Right.
that. But I've talked to other authors or writers of comedy in comics, and they've actually veered away from it. Like I have, and Kyle Starks has been a couple guests on here, a couple times guest on here, and he used to write solely, basically, comedy, and now he's veered over into more of the horror, and he's done some superhero stuff and stuff like that now. But like he was just saying, it was just like so hard to sell comics to people that were funny because people didn't want it. And I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, but I feel like there's a niche for it. I think there's the right voice behind it. And I feel like after reading a couple of yours, I'm like, I think your voice is right for that comedy genre.
Well, I hope so. I think that to me, in both cases, in all cases, it was really important to me that there be a serious story,
Mhm.
and in both Space Job and Masked Macher, there's a story going on there that that is serious. Like there's
Mhm.
a like so in Space Job there's a love story going
Yep.
on, and that's I take that seriously. I take
Mhm.
that the, this sort of star-crossed, so to speak, star-crossed lovers in Space Job who can't quite get together. It's the Jim and Pam of my
Yeah.
my
I was
office in
just
space.
thinking that. Yes, I was literally
Uh,
thinking that. I'm like, I don't know. I
right.
could. It's just thinking like, oh, how serious Jim and Pan's relationship on The Office was. But yeah,
And that's if you
yeah,
watch
yeah.
The Office when they do serious stuff, they're not doing jokes
Mhm.
during the serious stuff. It's a writer. I think it was a writer, Brent Forrester. I think his name is. I think it was Brent. I mean, I know Brent, but I'm saying
Mhm.
I think it was Brent who said that it was relaying that on The Office it was the McDLT was an old McDonald's hamburger, and you would have the hot side and the cool side. You kept them separate till you put them together. And so if you're doing drama on The Office, it's dramatic. They
Yeah.
don't do jokes. And then the comedy is the comedy. And I sort of do that in both. I try to do that in these comics. And Masked Macher has you'll sort of see as it's big and funny, but there's a sort of a sad moment in the first issue where Tony Hollywood makes a big decision, and then as the story goes on, you it gets kind of dark.
Mhm.
The story gets kind of dark, but the comedy's still there, and I think that's the key in comics is that a comic reader wants a wants a story that the writer takes seriously.
Mhm.
And I think I'm not commenting on uh, what that other writer you're
Yes.
referencing is saying because I'm not familiar with his work, but
Yeah.
I do think that I hope that readers come to this because the story has something to offer.
Yes. Yes. I think that's. I don't think anybody. I mean, not anybody. I think there's a space for just stupid jokes to make you laugh because I think that there is that. I mean, there is those
Yeah,
movies out. I mean, one of my
yeah.
favorite movies of all time is Grandma's Boy, and I feel like that entire movie is just making you laugh. It's not. There's no point to everything that's actually going on.
I've
It's
never seen
that
that
it.
movie. What is that
Oh,
movie?
Grandma's Boy. It's
Never heard of it.
Happy Madison. So it's
Oh,
it's those guys. Rob Schneider's in it and stuff like that.
all
But like,
right.
it's a movie that was one of those ones that was like under the radar, early 2000s probably, and it's just one of those. It's just a comedy that
Hmm.
there's just joke after joke after joke, and again at the end of it's what most horror slasher grossed out movies are to just make you go in the
Uh-huh.
comedy. It's just make there to make you laugh. It's there to make you
Uh-huh.
whatever.
Right.
However, most of us, I think most of us want some sort of story when we're reading. I don't. If I'm going to
Yeah.
invest into reading a comic book with all of
Yeah.
the comics that are on the market right now and all the options I have, I want to invest in something that actually has a story to it too. I mean,
Yeah.
you could, if you want to just tell jokes for joke's sake, write a comic strip because that gives
Right.
me 3 or 4 panels and I'm done.
Right. Right.
But like investing time, energy, effort, money into a comic book, I still want it to mean something.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
think, and one of my, I mean, my favorite show, probably my favorite show of all time is The Office. And I think there's episodes throughout that series that I actually cried at, David. Like I
Yeah.
physically was emotionally brought to tears. The
Yeah.
proposal of Jim and Pam in the gas station. I actually physically cried at those episodes. But then there's also ones where I'm like hurting that like I can't stop laughing.
Right. Right.
And so there's that you know position to balance both of them. And I think that there is a space for that. And going into it knowing that there's a story to it, like you just mentioned. There's actually like heart to it. There's emotion. there's jokes for jokes, but like, and there's thinking of your own personal life. I mean, he makes decisions in this book that I think a lot of us, not that specific decision. This is not
Right.
like I'm a
Right. Right.
1930s
Right.
wrestler and
Right.
so or actor, but makes decisions that we have all done. I mean, I did it. My day job is a creative director at a brewery, and
Oh wow.
before I started working for this brewery, there was the position there where it was, do I take this job at this brewery just because I want to work for this specific brewery, or I might make a lot less money at, or do
Right.
I continue working at the job that I did not like, but
Right.
I made pretty good money at? And I literally, when I woke up, it was like, if they offered me the job, I will cancel everything. I will have nothing. I will live in a box in the corner to get this job. And I think there's decisions that we make that are life decisions. And he does in this comic make a decision that could have screwed up a lot for him in a long time,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was a tough decision. But it's also a funny comic. Like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like
Yeah.
it's I don't know. There's a lot
Right.
in this first issue that I was not expecting to be in the first issue too.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
crammed a lot in this issue.
Yeah.
Well, it paced well, but it's just there's a lot in there going on in the first issue, which is awesome.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it absolutely is. It. I mean, I know you did the Orville at Dark Horse, and that's obviously a relationship that I'm guessing the TV studio and stuff like that, and the production
Right.
studio made a deal. But was Space Job and then this at Dark Horse because of your previous relationship with the publisher, or is it
Yeah.
just
Yeah. I met my editor Dave Marshall at Dark Horse. He was the editor of the Orville comics, and then after the Orville comics did pretty well. They for them they did the library edition. I don't
Mhm.
know if you've seen that. I'm
It's
very
beautiful.
I'm holding it up now.
Yeah,
It's
it's gorgeous. I
this
love their stuff that they do. Dark Horse is one of the
yeah
best in those like library print edition
yeah
things.
yeah. This is actually a an homage to a Justice League 100-page super spectacular cover. You familiar with it?
Mhm.
That was my Golden Fleece comic as a kid. I saw it as a kid. So a friend had it and showed it to me, and and it was my first introduction to multiple Earths, and
Mhm.
because Robin from Earth 2 was on it, Justice Society was on it too, and that was uh, uh, the comic that was always in my head. I have a copy of it now, and what,
Mhm.
but I told our very talented writer Dave Cabeza to do this for the library edition. But anyway, Dave Marshall was my editor, and then I just pitched him Space Job. I actually sent him the pilot script and said I think this would be a good comic,
Okay.
and so there are two. And then I did the same thing with Masked Macher, and they're creator-owned
Mhm.
comics. But up to this point for me, it's been a very fruitful relationship that was started because I had done the Orville comics, and I
Mhm.
think that uh, Dave, to his credit, let me write the comic, and I was a little. I had a lot to learn. He sent me, samples of other people's work to read, and gave me some pointers about how to lay out the script pages, and now I know what to do. But then I really was still learning a very
Mhm.
different format
Mhm.
than I was used to. But yeah,
Dark Horse is such a great publisher, in my opinion. They love their creators. They love the people that are helping promote their comics. They work with me a lot, really well, and
oh,
so on. So it's a great place. But and I feel like they feel like like it's weird how you work in TV. So it's like sometimes you feel like certain TV shows that end up on a certain network. You're like it feels like that network's show. Like it just
right,
feels like
right,
it's at home in that network. It makes
yeah,
sense. It
right,
makes sense.
right,
Yeah,
right.
and this is the same thing. I feel like that Space Job and this, they have a various variety of comics that they sell at Dark Horse, but it just feels at home. I feel like when they said, even, if you just guess, you don't even look at the publisher and you're typing it up. And I'm like, and Space Job brought to you by Dark Horse. Like
Right,
I
right,
just
right,
felt
right.
like that was like what it was. And so I do feel like it's at home at this publisher. And I feel like these library editions are great. Those kind of stuff, the future of the publishing of it, your trades, all that stuff. It's just great at Dark Horse. So I am happy that it's at Dark Horse for you.
Wow, thank you. No, I mean,
And
it's been a great company. They've been very supportive. So
yeah, it's awesome. Though actually, other note I forgot I mentioned, I kind of skipped ahead on was that you mentioned in the first issue. Like I mentioned, there's a lot going on in the Masked Macher in the first issue. There's some decisions being made. There's some comedy, like I said. There's some big surprises at the end. But I also feel like it's not just that one cliffhanger ending or whatever you would call it. It feels like it's a lot of threads that you don't know where are going.
Yep.
Like I feel
Right.
like that does make that different than any other, not any other, but most of the comedy comics is that there's actually parts where I'm like intrigued to find out where it goes, not
Right.
just the jokes that go along with it. And so there
Right.
is more to it than just comedy. And I thought that when I was like, because I wrote a note down when we did our review of the comic, was that yeah, it has so much future to it. And there's only 4 issues, right? So it can't go that
Yep.
far. They can't go that
Well,
many threads into there. But like
I
you
don't
know,
I wrap up the major things
okay,
in the first four,
yes,
but the other pieces that I do leave plenty of places to go. And the idea to me about it is, um, I think that it was. I was also writing I'm writing a bunch of things. It's a
yes,
comedy. It's a wrestling show, a comic. It's comment on Hollywood. It's also noir. There's
mm-hmm.
a couple of noir elements that really start to come out in issue two, but they're hinted at here a little bit, and the drawings, the way it's drawn, it looks like
Mm-hmm.
it's noir. I mean, that was what I told Alex and Gonzalo, the artists, to make it feel like a film noir kind of thing. So there's a bunch of threads, and I wanted each character to have their own sort of stories, and then also, because you have this narrator, you do sort of find out pretty quickly that the narrator isn't quite trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't know whether this you when you find out who the narrator is, and as the story goes on, is the narrator making stuff up? It's
Mm-hmm.
all interesting comment on that too, the idea of a narrated story. So there's a bunch of threads, and I just decided to sort of go with them all, and I wrap up some important ones, but I definitely leave some things unresolved at the end of issue four.
That's good. I mean, that's good too, because think about it, in most people's stories in general in life, things are not all wrapped up with a bow. There's some things you don't end up learning about
Right,
people, so
right,
that ends up working that
right,
way. But you know, you mentioned, and this is a comic book, and it feels like a comic book, and but the future of the world we live in right now is that things get adapted into to TV
right.
shows, movies, things like that. And you working in the TV industry and stuff, can I make a casting? I know he doesn't do TV, but Nicolas Cage would be a great mass mucker.
That he would be great. He would be great. I'm doing a show right now with Bruce Campbell. He
Yep.
would also be a
Yeah, he
great
would.
Matt
Yes. Yeah.
Tiger.
Yeah. Yes.
The character is kind of similar to one that I wrote with my partner in a TV movie in the '90s called The Adventures of Captain Zoom in Outer Space, which you can find on YouTube, I think.
Yeah.
An actor named Dan Rudin was in that. A lot of guys could play this
Yeah,
role.
yeah, yeah. It was just kind of fun. I was thinking about it. We just had this long conversation over the weekend at the comic convention I was at about Nicolas Cage, and I just like was like,
He's amazing.
all the
Yeah.
different like various things that Nicolas can play. I was just like, it's just so funny. My wife and I have a love for National Treasure, so it was one of the movies we bonded over when we first met. So we're always a Nicolas Cage fan. But yeah,
Well, I mean, I just saw him in Longlegs, and he's just
yes,
unbelievable.
that
So
Pig was phenomenal.
yeah,
But yeah, so yeah, he can star in a movie about himself. It's just
yeah.
whatever. But no, so you're in comics now. You've written Space Job, you've written this, you've written the Orville comic books. You're a comic book writer. I mean, obviously, you're a comic book. Anybody's a comic book writer when they write their first issue of comics. That's when it's published. You're
Right.
now considered a comic book writer. But now with multiple comics out, and you can actually justifyingly put it on your resume as a comic book writer. Is
Yeah.
it a future? Is this something that you continuously want to do? You have more pitches that you have that you want to make into comics that are solely made for comics?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hope so. I hope I get to do more. I think probably has to do with how well these things sell, but I also would. I mean, I, I, it's so interesting. I don't even know how it works, but I'd love to write uh, some DC comics or
Mhm.
Marvel. Like again, I don't know, and but I definitely have more uh, creator-owned ideas of things that I would like to try. Um, we just finished writing Masked Macher number 4,
Mhm.
and it's been drawn. And so I suppose I should talk to Dark Horse and start pitching
Yeah.
again.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love I love the fact that I get to do this, and I think they've Dark Horse again found these artists,
Mhm.
all 3 comics, 3 completely different styles,
Mhm.
and I loved working with all of them. They were all great partners.
They all unique. They all have their own unique identity to them, which is
Yeah,
great because I do have. There are comic book creators who partner with another creator or with an artist, a writer with an artist. That their comics all tend to look the same, which is fine. It works, and whatever.
right.
But I do love the writers who touch different artists that all
Yeah,
have great looking artwork. But it's like you can tell it's David. It's your comic. You can tell it's your comic, but it's different in the sense that there's a different artist
right.
per project is pretty cool in that sense. And I could see you
Yeah,
writing for DC or Marvel one of these days. It's a now you just gotta become friends with people. That's all it is. You just gotta
yeah. That's why
style up
I got
against
it.
some people,
Right,
and
right.
you'll
Yeah,
you'll get there. But I mean, touching on so that Mass Mocker, the first issue drops September 18th. Issue 2 comes October 23rd. There'll obviously be a collected trade too. If for some reason you
right.
can't find the first issue, I believe
Mhm.
you can also buy it on Dark Horse's website. So you should be able to find it
Yeah,
somewhere, and
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
digitally on Amazon or whatever. But you check it out; it's phenomenal. The trade is out for Space Job, which is also phenomenal in my opinion. If you want a
Oh,
nice
thank you
thing,
so much.
I do think if you're a fan of the Orville, you'll appreciate
Right.
Space Job in my opinion. You want to laugh, you want to have a good time, but also again, story with heart and story with meaning. But you also have a TV show coming out, so I wanted to
That's
just
right.
quickly touch on that. October 18th on Peacock, Hysteria drops. What's Hysteria
Right.
all about?
Hysteria is about it takes place in a small town in Michigan, and when a high school quarterback goes missing, it sort of leads into a mystery of what happened to him, and it's in conjunction with a story of a high school band who decide to pretend they're Satanists just at the wrong time. This takes place in the 80s. It's a period show, and it's high school, it's horror, it's a little bit of comedy, and a great cast. Julie Bowen, Bruce Campbell, Anna Camp, a great group of teenagers playing the kids, and it's a lot of great heavy metal music, a lot of great music all across
Mm,
the show. A lot, not just metal,
yeah,
but they're a heavy metal band and they're terrific in the show. And it's 8 episodes. It's a really cool show. I didn't create it. It was created by Matthew Scott Kane. I was brought in to help him
yeah.
uh, do his show, and I'm really proud to be a part of it.
Yeah, but so you're still actively working TV. You're actively working comics. You keep them
Mhm.
busy.
It's always important to do everything you can. Uh,
Yeah,
I did a movie I'm very proud of that came out a couple years ago now, Honor Society,
society. Yeah.
which is actually how I got this job. Matt had read the script for that and thought I could write high school kids. Um, but it's yeah, no, it's very important to try to do everything you can to keep your career going. So
Yes, exactly. It was funny this weekend. I was talking to some of my these comic creators that are friends of mine here in Maine, and I was telling them that I was talking to you today on the podcast to they asked about upcoming episodes and things like that, and I was like, oh yeah, and David wrote a movie a couple years ago called Honor Society. It has the woman from Spider-Man in it because I was trying to figure out people's names. I was trying to figure out
yeah.
like okay, yeah, I don't understand what you're talking about.
And Gowrie Rice is her name.
Yes, exactly.
That's
But it was at
yeah,
the time I was like, gosh, I don't know and then you're just like referencing a different movie, a movie that they would understand and they would know
right,
because it's a
right,
comic book comic convention. But yeah, so it was kind of funny on that side. But
That's funny.
I'm excited. Yes, I'm excited for to watch it. It looks phenomenal. Outside of talking to you, it just looked like a cool TV show. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's
Thing
a
coming
fun
up
show. It's just
October
totally.
18th on Peacock.
Yeah.
Will be dropping. That's awesome. And then, like I said, Masked Macher is on shelves. You tell your local comic book store anyway, because even if you didn't get it or you missed it or whatever, I mean, there's a possibility that Diamond still has some in stock, so they can
Mhm.
send out to your local comic book shop, and they usually
All
come
right.
in with a couple of days. So make sure you tell your LCS that you want it, because you still
Mhm.
potentially could get it. If not, there's always digital. There's always waiting for the trade. But I highly recommend reading it if you want a new story to read. It's different, and that's the other thing is there's so much out there that's very similar. And
Mhm.
we had a long discussion again at this comic book convention about Marvel and DC, and there's a lot of just repetitive things over and over again, which is
Yeah, yeah.
what they have to do. Kind of, it's just
Right, I guess.
their thing. Um, but the unique comics are the ones that are standing out a little bit more, in my opinion. And I think that you can't help but say the Mass Mocker is not a unique comic.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
pretty
yeah.
sure
No,
it's.
it's very unique. Yeah,
And I
very
mean,
unique.
it hits a bunch of things. It hits the noir thing, like you mentioned, the
Mhm.
comedy. But I mean, wrestling fans should love it.
Yeah,
I think there's
yeah.
no reason why
Um,
wrestling fans shouldn't be picking this up. I mean, I think put it on the shelf next to Daniel Warren Johnson's Do a Power Bomb, and there you go. You got these independent wrestling, comic books
no, I
out
wanted
there.
to. Yeah, I really wanted it to feel like people who were fans of wrestling would get things that there's a lot in there for them. I
Mhm.
think. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm gonna watch Wings again. I gotta find out where I can watch Wings again. I got and I mean, I don't know if you can say anything, but are we getting more Orville, or is this
You know,
you,
I don't know.
okay?
Last I talked to Seth, he was trying to get it going, and the thing is, I would never count Seth out. I
No.
mean, he got Family Guy back. It's hard to remember that show was canceled a
Yeah.
couple times. Came back. He got Orville picked up,
Yeah.
and he wants to do more. When he's done with Ted, he's doing
Yeah.
the second season of Ted right now. So I think there's a very good chance, but
Yes.
I haven't heard anything definitive.
I'd be excited when it comes back. I mean, it was one of those few shows that I could get my wife to watch with me. Like usually
Yeah,
we are like on separate, and that was one of the ones where like
yeah,
binged the whole thing during the pandemic, which was
yeah.
phenomenal. But yeah,
Oh, cool.
but yeah. So yeah, grab those comics, continue writing. I appreciate everything that you do, and I appreciate you taking time to
Well,
talk to us
Justin,
here on the podcast.
thanks for having me on. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah. I'm looking forward, and we'll have you back on at some point talking about different projects
All
in the
right.
future. Whether it's TV, movies, or comics. We'll chat. Sound good?
Yeah, anytime.
Thanks, David.